Good evening and welcome to Ultimate Stream Live. Tonight we're going to be taking a look at two somewhat celebrated amplifiers from Hegel Music Systems, the H390 and H590. I'm delighted to be joined by Vice President of Sales and Marketing for Hegel Music Systems, Anders Ertzeid, and by the editor of Hi-Fi Plus magazine, Alan Sircom. Thanks for joining me. Anders, I wonder if I can start with you. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit about Hegel. I think you're based in Norway.
We are indeed. So I'm sitting here in cold Oslo in Norway. We're enjoying the cold summer at home. Hegel is very, very much based around technology. So the reason we exist was actually the development of this patent back in the mid-90s. Which is a patented, slightly different amplifier technology. We call it an adaptive feed-forward technology that dynamically cancels out distortion. We tried to license that in the beginning to other manufacturers of amplifiers without much success. And then we started implementing it in our own products. And today we only use this technology in the Hegel products. So we started with that in 2002. And we've been growing steadily year by year for the last, almost 20 years. So we're focusing on integrated amplifiers. We have CD players, DA converters, pre and power amplifiers. So a reasonably full range of audio electronics.
I came on board with Hegel, I think it was probably around 2017. And I actually met you the first time at the Bristol Hi-Fi show. And you were demonstrating Hegel amplifiers along with Amplifier loudspeakers. And I was really impressed by the overall sound. So I ended up taking on both brands. Since then, you've introduced firstly the 590 and then the 390. So the product range has changed quite a lot, I think. Well, what brought about the desire to sort of add the 390 and the 590 to the product lineup?
Well, the thing with the 590 was several reasons. One of them was actually that it started out as a new power amplifier. We wanted to make a new, really, really good power amplifier. Until somebody from who makes the speakers behind me, Kef, who is a very, very big partner for us in some parts of the world, came and said, who wants a pre and power if they can get everything in one box? And our founder had also really wanted to see, how we could take the concept from our integrated amplifiers and make it significantly better. We were, even with the 390, it's about 5,500 pounds, I think, if I don't remember all wrong.
4,900.
Well, that's good pricing in the UK then. Even at that price, it's a pricey amplifier, but you're still on a very tight budget. So we wanted to see, how far we could take it if we started spending a little bit more money on things, and so came the 590.
Alan, what's your thoughts on the 390 and 590 sort of price wise in terms of the whole gamut of amplification that's available out there? Do they represent good value for money, and how do they perform against the competition?
I think they perform very well. I mean, I think as Anders said, the 590 really came first, and it's essentially as much amplifier as you can cram into a box at the money. And yes, people may say that they prefer some slightly different presentation. It's a broad church. Not everyone has the same taste, but at that price point, it's an amplifier to beat. There's so much technology and so much performance packed into it. It really does set a high bar. The difficulty from there is what do you do with the designs under that? So you've got something where you've got the models that sort of preceded it. Because I've spent some time listening to Hegel amps. And the models that preceded it were very good, but they were so eclipsed by the 590 that the jump in performance from the 360, I think it was, to the 590 was so vast that there needed to be a kind of change working through the line, and I think the 390 really came along there. What surprised me when I heard the 390 was actually just how good it was. It was so close to the 590. Yes, the 590 is better, and I'm sure if you do a comparison between the two side by side, most people will go for the 590 if they can, but the 390 is substantially good enough on its own for people to sit there and say, well, I'm done here. I'm good. And I think one of the problems when you get to the 590 is, where do you go from there? I mean, I've played around with some extraordinarily expensive electronics, and yes, there are nuances and it's better, but in some respects, you're gilding the lily. You're adding a little more. The sort of, for most high-end audiophiles, most high-end music lovers, that's as far as you need to go. And in many respects, the 390 is as far as you need to go for many people. And I think if you do this, as I said, if you sit down and listen to the two side by side, you can definitely hear the difference between the 390 and the 590. I think the justification between the two is that you either feel that that's a bit too much you're going to spend on an audio amplifier full stop. So the 390 is your kind of parking place that's your happy place in how much money you're going to spend. I don't think there's very many people who would listen to the two and say either I can't hear a big difference. They would hear what the 390 does, the 590 does better. So I can see I can see people saying that go no further than that, but I can't see them necessarily saying, oh well, the 390. The 590 isn't as good as the 390 in any respect.
And as you call the 590 master and commander, and the 390 sort of the Robin Hood. I presume that's because the 390's stolen quite a lot of the technology from the 590.
Yeah, I mean, the DA converter section is essentially the same in both. And the topology is the same. One thing our owner says when we discuss this often is that if you, in digital you can still be really smart and get a lot done for a reasonable price. And actually, if you take the DAC inside the 390 and measure it on digital performance, you can compare it to almost anything regardless of price, and it will not be worse. I mean, you can compare it to a 20,000 pound DAC, standalone DAC, and it will match it on digital spec. And a lot of the precision and level of detail and things that you hear in the 390 and 590 is because of the really good DAC inside. But still, if you take the DAC in a 390 or a 590 and compare it in listening to a, I don't know, 20, 30,000 pound DCS, it will still not sound as good because the DCS is also a really good DAC. Now, the reason for that is very much on the analog, because the sound is in the analog stage, and that is still, you know, if you want to take it those extra steps, that does cost money, and that is the difference between a 390 and a 590. The experience for me, if you listen to just a guy playing a simple guitar and it's not a superb recording, you may not hear a huge difference between the two amplifiers. But if you put on an old Led Zeppelin track or CC Top, I mean, I read one of Alan's reviews lately and he said he very often listened to Lagrange, and when you put that on, you just feel the texture in the 590 that you just don't have in a 390, and that is due to the analog stage differences.
And is this what you found as well, Alan?
Yeah, I mean, I'd also say it's in some parts to do with, I mean, not just the analog stages in the preamp, but the sheer sort of grip, I mean, Hegel play a big thing about damping factor, and I know there are some people who poo-poo the idea even as a notion, but what you can hear between the two is on the one hand, if you've got the same pair of loudspeakers and you move from one to the other, that pair of loudspeakers seem that bit more controlled, that bit bigger, that bit more punchier. On the other hand, you can probably throw a much bigger pair of loudspeakers at a pair of 590s at a 590, given that the 390 can pretty much drive anything that well, more or less anything. That takes the 590 into a really kind of mullet type system thing where you could have a very, very expensive pair of loudspeakers hanging off the end of the 590, making the 590 seem like the cheapest part in the system, which at an amp for roughly 10 grand is going to be quite impressive. I think the big part is, yeah, there's a kind of grip and there's a control and there's an authority, which, I mean, in a way, the Hegel amps do very well across the board. Even the sort of entry level models are very good at making a kind of grippy, powerful sound, a bigger sound than you would expect. But when you get up to the sort of 390 and especially the 590, that is real control. That's proper sort of that's V8 power, if you want. There's so much in reserve that the loudspeakers are really well controlled and playing as you want them to hear, which as Anders said, yeah, in rock, but especially in some, I mean, sort of big classical pieces as well. If you play a big orchestral piece, the difference between the two is that one seems to have a really good sense of scale and a really good sense of power, and then you step up and you feel more of the concert hall. You feel more kind of engaged in this sound, and I mean it's an odd. I have to say it's an odd experience, because listening to the 390 in and of itself, it does all you want, and it's only when you move up to the 590 and you listen to 590, you think, oh, okay, yeah, now I see what I was missing. That sort of sense is really there, and once you hear it, it's very difficult to go back.
I've noticed there's quite a big difference, even with less expensive loudspeakers. You put the two up against each other, or maybe a pair of speakers around the sort of £4,000 to £5,000 mark, and you can hear a noticeable difference with the 590. There, as you said, there seems to be a lot more grip and more control. But that's not saying that it's sort of lacking with the 390. It's just there's just more of it, or it just seems that there's more of it. In terms of sort of the balance of budget, would you look at a 390 with more expensive loudspeakers, or a 590 with less expensive loudspeakers?
I'm going to guess Anders has got a very set idea about which way that goes.
I was just thinking that is the most awful question ever.
It is, but it's one that people ask.
I'm going to sort of answer a question with a question, but it's what's your room like? In some respects, I mean, an interesting demonstration that's relevant, I mean, directly relevant, because we've mentioned all of those things today. The demonstration that Hegel, Johan was doing at Hegel in Bristol this year, was running through the amplifiers with a pair of KEF LS50s. And it was a relatively small hotel room, so a pair of LS50s actually sing really well in a room like that. What was clear was you could really hear the differences in the stages moving up from, I can't remember what the first one was, but it was a moderately good Hegel amp, right the way up to a 590, and you could hear the stages easily, even on a pair of LS50s. That's not saying a pair of LS50s are a bad loudspeaker, but they're a bookshelf loudspeaker that's always going to be bandwidth limited. So you've got a room where it's 12 by 16 or smaller in imperial. So in that context, a pair of small loudspeakers will sing, and getting the most out of them is the best path to take. If you've got, for example, the LS50s as described, then throwing good money at the amplifiers will return you a better sound. The loudspeakers still have a lot to give. If you move up to a bigger room, say, you know, you're living in a place where it's a 4 by 5 meter, 4 by 6 meter room, 2024, whatever, and you've got a pair of small two-way loudspeakers, then the big change is going to be changing the loudspeakers. And in some respects, if you've got a good amplifier, the amplifier will be able to take that upgrade. It'll be the next thing that you look at. In ultimate terms, it's probably best looking at this as a whole system. But in terms of, if you can only afford to upgrade one thing, upgrade the amplifier. If it's a smaller room and you're happy with what you've got. If you're moving into a bigger room, it's time to look at the loudspeakers. Eventually, all roads lead back to the whole system concept. So you'll look at the amplifier again, and you look at the loudspeakers again. If you tweak if you have a system where you try and squeeze and shoehorn a big pair of speakers into a system, no matter how much you spend on amplifiers, cables, everything else, it will never quite sound as good as a pair of right-sized speakers for that room.
Anders, I guess you've got a view on this as well.
I certainly do. Well, but maybe not the one that people expect me to have, even though the system in my own living room back home is a pair of LS50 with a Hegel H590, which is why we had that system on the Bristol show, because I thought it sounded really good at home. But that would not be a normal. And opposite, I'm actually also a fan of speakers like Harbeth. It's a completely different thing, but they sound lovely. And I'm also a partaker at, the Harbeth discussion groups and forums, and they are on the complete opposite end. Go for speakers and then buy some amplifier. I think the truth is, from our point of view, is that you should choose the speakers you love. You choose your instrument in the speakers. If they are big, if they are small, if they are round, whatever. Our smallest integrated amp, which is 1,400 pounds or something, is tuned on these KEF blades. So it will work in any case, but choose your speakers. That is the single thing that will impact the voicing and sound of your system the most, and then you choose the best Hegel amplifier you can afford for it.
Anders, I've heard you talk about voicing with amplifiers. I presume this is different to the voicing we talk about with loudspeakers. Is it something that goes on within R&D?
Yeah, good point, because we don't really voice it. I call it voicing because my native language is Norwegian, so it's a translation error. Because when you voice speakers, you tune them like you tune the cabinet of a guitar. For instance, when you voice an amplifier, what you're doing is you're listening for errors. You're listening for things that the measurements you didn't reveal. For instance, it could be there's some things are very difficult to measure, like bass response. Sometimes you're not detecting certain levels of high frequency distortion, or you may detect it, but you don't know if it's audible or not. That's the kind of thing I listen to when I call it voicing. So I will get amplifiers on my desk during R&D without any knowledge of what has been measured or done in this amplifier, from the last time I listened to it. I put it on the system and I listen for errors.
I'd really go along with that. I think that what you seem to get is that a company that doesn't voice, but as you said, listens for errors, tends to produce very consistent products. Now, it may be that they're consistent in a slightly different direction to someone else's consistency, and that might be that there are a group of errors that you will listen for and prioritize, and another group of errors that you will listen for and not prioritize. So, which explains the difference between maybe, as you said, so we're here with a Hegel amplifier, and somebody walks in and says, well, I much prefer, say, an exposure or a name or a Krell or whatever it is. And a lot of that is I don't want to say trading errors, because that makes it sound like everything's broken, but it's a sense of you have to look at what your priorities are. Yes, and this in some respects is when you do get to the absolute stratospheric products at their very best, and the number of ones that are very good, you could probably count on the fingers of one knee. The very best amplifiers have very few of those compromises included, or very few of those sort of errors included, because fundamentally they are throwing money at the project, and that's where those limitations are going to be hopefully ironed out. On the other hand, there's a lot of companies where you listen and you think this is very much a designer's outlook. The designer has very much listened for a specific target, and that's what they've ended up with. And you know, both ways are valid. I prefer the sort of trying to minimize the most number of errors possible, and that tends to come back to the same companies time and time again, and the ones that demonstrate that consistency from cheapest to most expensive.
Both amplifiers are Class AB. Alan, do you have a view on Class AB against Class D amplification, for example?
I think we get very carried away with looking at amplifier classes. It's kind of not really relevant. It is, because there are certain characteristics that seem common to certain types of amplifier. But a lot of this, I think, is very much hewn from the past, that we have 40, 50 years ago, the difference between Class A and Class AB was the difference between an amplifier that sounded lovely and an amplifier that didn't. And in the course of decades of working with this, we have made Class A has come forward in terms of they've managed to control the heat slightly more, they've managed to do all sorts of things, but it's still ultimately a low running, very, very nice sounding amplifier because of the crossover, the switching distortion. Whereas when you're looking at Class AB, that has really grown. We have learned a lot about how to make that sound good. And people are learning the same thing about Class D and Class whatever. I mean, there's XD and all these ones that manufacturers come up with. But if you listen to a well-engineered Class D amplifier, it sounds pretty good. If you listen to a well-engineered Class AB amplifier, it sounds pretty good. If you listen to a Class A amplifier, it sounds pretty good. On the other hand, if you listen to a badly engineered Class A amplifier, it'll sound awful. Same applies throughout. I think it's more a question of doing the exercise properly, and as said, listening for distortions.
The technology that you have in the 590 is dual mono.
Yeah, although it's of course it's one toroidal transformer, but yeah, it's a dual mono design, and it's one of the things that distinguishes the 390 and 590 from the rest of the group, is that the different channels, and not only the channels but the sections of the amplifier, is very much better shielded and from one another. And that is also one of the differences between a 390 and a 590. That the preamp and DAC is better shielded and protected from the output stages.
And I think you have on the 590, it's an aluminium chassis.
Yeah, on the 390 it's aluminium on the front panel, but the bottom chassis and top side covers are steel, and that does make a difference. You can easily hear it. I was puzzled the first time I heard it, because I was comparing two similar amplifiers 6-7 years ago on the desk, and they were supposed to sound the same, but they didn't, and they were quite far from the same. And then I noticed that, yeah, sure, one has the lid off, so I put a lid on it, and suddenly they sounded the same again, which was puzzling to me, but now it's obvious.
So with regards to streaming, the amplifiers support Spotify Connect, UPnP, there'll soon be Roon endpoints, and AirPlay. And I was particularly impressed with the quality of AirPlay reproduction. Is this something you spent quite a lot of time on when you were in the research and development processes?
On AirPlay in general, it was the first kind of streaming technology that we implemented in the amplifiers, and we started that project back in 2013 when there was an SDK launched by Apple, so you could do something more with it to avoid a lot of the extra resampling that's going on within AirPlay. So we designed an AirPlay implementation that sounds really good and that uses our own resampling and signal treatment in the digital stage, and that makes a big difference.
And MQA as well is available in its native format.
Yeah, it is. Although I shall admit that on the 590, it only supports full MQA on the USB input, while we made a little physical change, hardware change in the 390. So the 390 will accept it on all digital inputs with a second, or I think they call it third unfolding. There's been some terminology updates with MQA.
We touched on Rune. Dare I ask if it's far off, or is it still under development?
Yeah, I mean, if I couldn't defend that, what's going on there, being my fault to launch it a bit too early, then who would I be? Well, Rune has taken forever, and forever is a mighty long time. So we have been very delayed for a number of reasons, and finally there has been a lot of progression this spring. So I'm really hoping we can send the first amplifiers in for certifications very soon. I have learned to not give predictions in it's going to happen in 2 weeks, or it's going to happen in 7 years, or
But we are getting closer.
We are getting a lot closer. We do streaming a little differently because one of the first things we thought when we did our little streaming things was that we also wanted to make the amplifiers controllable and very responsive. So we decided all along to go for streaming boards that weren't Linux based. So it's not a complete computer inside. That does make them much more responsive, but it also makes it a lot more difficult to implement new technology, and especially Rune proved a little bit more difficult.
But you can, with AirPlay, you can use Rune software. You've still got control over the volume with AirPlay, so you can stream Redbook CD.
What I use at home is I have a MacBook sitting in somewhere in the shelf with a USB cable to my 590, and I use the Rune application. And on the 590 and 390, we made a special feature so you could allow Rune to remote control the volume control over USB. So I can still use the Rune app just as if it was Rune ready, and use the Rune volume slider and play Rune to it, which make it quite user-friendly.
I think it's quite interesting. I mean, as a company that specializes in streaming, sometimes you forget how many people are using other sources, how many people are using their record deck tuners, etc. So it's a great amplifier on the analog side to replay your vinyl and listen to other sources as well.
Run out and buy it. You can buy both, and then you can compare at home.
I've done that. I've got both of them here.
Which do you prefer?
Oh, it's a difficult one. My sort of speaker to go to are the big Amphion Krypton 3s, and the 590 just seems to work beautifully with those. I've actually got a customer in Bournemouth who's bought a 590 with a pair of Kryptons and a 390 with a pair of the Amphion 7LSs. And both systems just sound, fantastic.
It's that consistency again. I mean, I think that's one of the reasons why I don't know if it's a reason why you recommend it. Certainly a reason why I do is that I know that there are some electronics companies who make a great product, but you know that you have to be editorial about the way that the loudspeaker matches. You can't sit there and say, "We'll put this with more or less anything." And the Hegel's one of the few concept amps from beginning from the bottom to the top where yeah, theoretically, you can more or less put it with any amp, with any loudspeaker, and you'll get consistent and good results. So it's not one of those ones where, yeah, I can't quite recommend you using X with Y because I know that there's something goes a bit wrong there. At least with Hegel, I can sit there. You can sit there and say, yeah, I can recommend this to almost anyone, no matter what the loudspeakers are, even if it's something that I don't necessarily know of.
So, Anders, I guess I should ask you, what's next with Hegel? Have you got any sort of anything you can share with us about new products?
Well, yes and no. I can't tell you what it is, but we had a first ever experience the other day, because we are obviously working on new things. And we are in the midst of running some pilot production runs of a new analog piece of thing. And they called us yesterday from the factory and said that there is something wrong with our audio precision measuring equipment, because they're supposed to measure, every single item with audio precision to detect and sort out the distortion and blah, blah, blah. But they couldn't find any distortion. There was not any measurable distortion on the audio precision. So they thought there was something wrong. So they had to bring it to us, and then we put it on our own audio precision, and there was no distortion measurable, which was quite neat. And that product would be on the market next spring. So I can't talk to you about it.
So Munich next year. Okay. Well, Anders and Alan, thank you very much for joining me this evening. It's been great to have you both on the show, and I look forward to welcoming you both back in a not too distant future.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Well, we've reached the end of another episode. Thank you for joining me. I do hope you've enjoyed tonight's show. If you'd like a demonstration of any of the Hegel products, please do get in touch. And if you'd like further information, or you'd like to read Alan Sircom's reviews of the H390 and the H590, please visit our website ultimate-stream.live, where you'll find all of the various links. I'll be back in a couple of weeks, so I look forward to seeing you then, and please don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. See you soon.